The world knew him as the voice that made women faint, the crooner who could sell out any venue in America. But on November 26, 1938, in a cold police station in Hackensack, New Jersey, 23-year-old Frank Sinatra wasn't singing. He was being fingerprinted, photographed, and cataloged like a common criminal. The charge? Seduction and adultery with a married woman. But what the young singer didn't know that morning, as the flashbulb exploded in his face for his first mugshot, was that this wasn't just another scandal that would fade with tomorrow's newspapers. This was the moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file on Francis Albert Sinatra, a file that would grow to over 2,000 pages across 5 decades, tracking his every move, every phone call, every friendship with men the government called the most dangerous criminals in America. That single arrest in 1938 wasn't the end of a bad decision. It was the beginning of a 50-year surveillance operation that would follow Sinatra from Hoboken dive bars to the White House, from cheap nightclubs to meetings with mafia kingpins in Havana, from his Hollywood mansion to secret FBI interrogation rooms. And the question that haunted J. Edgar Hoover's agents for half a century was simple but terrifying. Was Frank Sinatra just a talented singer who made bad friends? Or was he organized crime's most valuable asset hiding in plain sight behind a microphone? If you want to discover the untold story behind America's most watched entertainer, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about Frank Sinatra. Francis Albert Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, in a cold-water tenement at 415 Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. His mother, Dolly, was a force of nature, a political fixer and midwife who ran the neighborhood with an iron fist and connections that reached deep into the Democratic Party machine. His father, Marty, was a quiet fireman who taught his son one lesson above all others: keep your head down, don't make trouble, and respect the men who run things. But young Frank didn't inherit his father's quiet nature. He inherited his mother's ambition, her temper, and most dangerously, her belief that rules were for other people. By the time Frank was 15, he dropped out of high school, convinced that education was a waste of time for someone destined for greatness. He'd seen how the world really worked in Hoboken, a gritty port city where longshoremen, politicians, and men with Italian surnames and expensive suits controlled everything that mattered. His mother's connections gave him a window into that world, and young Sinatra was paying attention. What Frank Sinatra had that nobody else possessed was his voice. Not just the technical ability, though that would come with time and training, but something deeper and more primal. When Sinatra sang, even as a teenager performing at local social clubs and Italian festivals, something happened in the room. Women stopped talking, men stopped drinking. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next note. It was a gift that couldn't be taught, couldn't be faked, and couldn't be ignored. By 1935, Sinatra had scraped together enough money and connections to start performing with small bands around New Jersey. He sang for tips at the Rustic Cabin, a roadhouse on Route 9W that was known for two things: pretty good music and very good illegal gambling in the back rooms. The owner, Harry Steeper, had connections to Willie Moretti, a powerful figure in the Genovese crime family who controlled much of northern New Jersey's rackets. Sinatra didn't ask questions about who owned what or where the money came from. He just sang, collected his $75 a week, and dreamed of bigger stages. But in 1938, Frank Sinatra's personal life was a disaster. He'd married his childhood sweetheart, Nancy Barbato, in February of that year, a small ceremony at Our Lady of Sorrows Church in Jersey City. Nancy was sweet, loyal, and completely unprepared for what it meant to be married to a man who believed he was destined to conquer the world. Within months, Sinatra was spending more time on the road than at home, and his eye was already wandering to the women who gathered around the stage every night, offering things that a loyal housewife from Hoboken couldn't provide. One of those women was Antoinette de la Penta Frank, a married woman from Lodi, New Jersey, who'd become infatuated with the skinny singer with the blue eyes and devastating smile. What Sinatra didn't know was that Antoinette's husband, a man named Frank, had friends in the Bergen County prosecutor's office. And when those friends heard about the affair, they saw an opportunity to make an example out of the Italian kid who thought he was better than everyone else. The knock came early on a Saturday morning. Frank Sinatra was still in bed when the Bergen County Sheriff's deputies arrived at his small apartment with an arrest warrant. The charge was seduction, a morality law that dated back to the 19th century and was rarely enforced unless someone with connections wanted it enforced. According to the warrant, Sinatra had engaged in sexual relations with a married woman under the promise of marriage, a legal fiction that made the affair a criminal act rather than just a social scandal. Sinatra's first reaction wasn't fear, it was rage. Volcanic, explosive rage that would become his signature response to anything he perceived as disrespect or betrayal. He shouted at the deputies, threatened lawsuits, invoked his mother's political connections, and made it absolutely clear that he considered this arrest a personal insult orchestrated by small-minded people who were jealous of his talent and success. None of it mattered. By 10 o'clock that morning, Frank Sinatra was standing in the Hackensack police station, being processed like any other criminal. The photographer told him to hold the placard with his arrest number and look at the camera. Sinatra's jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscles twitching. His eyes, those famous blue eyes that would one day be celebrated in song and story, were cold and filled with barely controlled fury. The flashbulb exploded. Mugshot number 42799 was created, capturing forever the moment when Francis Albert Sinatra, aged 23, became a criminal in the eyes of the law. What happened next reveals everything about how justice worked in 1938 New Jersey. The Bergen County prosecutor, a man whose name appears in documents but whose connections remain murky even today, decided to make Sinatra an example. The local newspapers, always hungry for scandal involving Italian immigrants and moral corruption, ran the story with headlines that dripped with judgment and barely concealed ethnic bias. "Crooner arrested in love nest raid," screamed one paper. "Italian singer faces adultery charges," declared another. For 3 days, Frank Sinatra was the most talked-about criminal in northern New Jersey, his mugshot reprinted in papers from Newark to Paterson. But then something interesting happened. The charges were suddenly dropped. According to court records that were later declassified, the prosecutor's office discovered that Antoinette Della Penta Frank had lied on one crucial detail. She was already separated from her husband when the affair began, which meant legally she wasn't married, which meant the seduction of a married woman charge couldn't stand. The case collapsed. Sinatra walked free, and the local papers moved on to the next scandal. It should have been over. An embarrassing moment, a close call, a lesson learned about being more careful with married women. But it wasn't over, because 400 miles away in Washington, D.C., in a massive stone building that housed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, someone had clipped the newspaper article about Sinatra's arrest and placed it in a fresh manila folder. That folder was labeled Francis Albert Sinatra, subject racketeering influences. And next to the newspaper clipping, someone had attached a note in careful handwriting, subject performs at establishments owned by known associates of organized crime, recommend monitoring for further criminal associations. To understand why a simple morality arrest triggered FBI interest, you have to understand what was happening in America in 1938. The Bureau, led by the ambitious and increasingly powerful J. Edgar Hoover, was in the middle of a massive campaign against what they called the organized crime menace. The days of prohibition were over, but the criminal empires built on bootlegging hadn't disappeared. They'd evolved, moved into gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, and most profitably, control of legitimate businesses that could be used to launder illegal profits. Nightclubs, restaurants, entertainment venues, these were perfect fronts for moving dirty money into clean investments, and the FBI had noticed a pattern. The most successful clubs, the ones that attracted the biggest crowds and generated the most cash, all had one thing in common. They featured live entertainment, particularly singers and musicians who could draw loyal audiences night after night. Frank Sinatra performed at the Rustic Cabin, a club that FBI agents had been watching for months because of its connections to Willie Moretti. They documented the gambling operation in the back rooms, photographed known criminals entering through the kitchen door, and recorded license plates of cars that belonged to men with extensive criminal records. When Sinatra's arrest hit the papers, an FBI analyst made a connection that would shape the next 5 decades. The analyst pulled the surveillance files on the Rustic Cabin and noticed something interesting. On nights when Sinatra performed, the gambling operation in the back rooms did significantly more business. The crowds that came to hear him sing stayed to gamble, drink, and spend money that flowed through Willie Moretti's operation and into the wider network of organized crime that controlled New Jersey. This wasn't proof of anything criminal on Sinatra's part. He was just a singer, doing his job, probably unaware of exactly what happened in those back rooms. But to the FBI, it suggested something more troubling, that Sinatra, whether he knew it or not, was valuable to organized crime. His talent drew crowds, crowds generated money, and money was the lifeblood of the criminal empires the Bureau was trying to destroy. The analyst wrote in his report, "Subject Sinatra's entertainment value creates economic opportunity for racketeering elements. Recommend continued observation to determine if subject is witting participant or unknowing asset." That single sentence, buried in a 1938 FBI report that wouldn't be declassified for over 60 years, became the foundation of a surveillance operation that would never truly end. The arrest should have ruined Frank Sinatra. In 1938 America, moral scandals could destroy careers, especially for someone from a working-class Italian family trying to break into an entertainment industry controlled by established, mostly white, mostly Protestant businessmen. But something unexpected happened. The publicity from the arrest, even though it was negative, made Sinatra's name known beyond the small circuit of New Jersey nightclubs. Booking agents who'd never heard of him suddenly knew who Frank Sinatra was. Club owners in New York City, always looking for acts that generated buzz, started calling. Within 6 months of his arrest, Sinatra had landed a spot with Harry James's orchestra, a major step up from singing at roadhouses. The pay jumped to $75 a week, and more importantly, he was performing at venues that mattered, places where music industry executives and radio producers came to scout new talent. By 1940, Sinatra had moved to Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, one of the most popular big bands in America, and his salary had jumped to $150 a week. He was recording songs that got played on national radio. His voice, that distinctive baritone with perfect phrasing and emotional depth, was being heard by millions of people from coast to coast. But the FBI file kept growing, because as Sinatra's star rose, so did his connections to the men who controlled entertainment in America. The music business in the 1940s wasn't the clean corporate industry it would later become. It was rough, competitive, and deeply infiltrated by organized crime. Record distribution was controlled by men with ties to the mob. Radio play could be bought through payoffs to disc jockeys and station managers. The best venues were owned by people whose legitimate businesses were just the visible tip of criminal empires. Sinatra, ambitious and willing to do whatever it took to succeed, didn't ask too many questions about who owned what or where the money came from. When a club owner in Chicago offered him a 2-week engagement at a salary 3 times what he was making with Dorsey, Sinatra took it. The fact that the owner, according to FBI records, was a known associate of the Chicago outfit didn't concern the young singer. Business was business, and Frank Sinatra was in the business of becoming famous. The FBI agents watching him saw something different. They saw a pattern of associations that suggested either incredible naivety or deliberate cultivation of criminal connections. In their reports from this period, which have been partially declassified, agents noted that Sinatra frequently socializes with known racketeering elements and appears comfortable in the presence of subjects under federal investigation. They documented his appearances at clubs owned by mob-connected businessmen, his friendly interactions with men who were under active investigation, and most troubling to the Bureau, the favors that seemed to flow in his direction. When Sinatra wanted out of his contract with Tommy Dorsey in 1942, a contract that legally bound him for 3 more years, the problem was solved with remarkable speed. Dorsey, according to multiple accounts, suddenly agreed to release Sinatra for a token payment, despite the fact that the singer had become one of his biggest draws. Years later, rumors would circulate that Willie Moretti, Sinatra's old New Jersey connection, had paid Dorsey a visit and made an offer that couldn't be refused. The FBI documented those rumors, interviewed witnesses, and added more pages to the growing file on Francis Albert Sinatra. By 1943, Frank Sinatra was no longer just a singer with a good voice, he was a phenomenon. The Sinatra swoon was a national craze, with teenage girls fainting at his concerts, screaming his name, and creating a level of mass hysteria that America had never seen before. He'd signed a contract with Columbia Records, appeared in his first Hollywood films, and was earning more money than he'd ever imagined growing up in that Hoboken tenement. The skinny kid who'd been arrested 5 years earlier for a morality charge was now one of the most famous men in America, his face on magazine covers, his voice on every radio station, his future seemingly unlimited. But in FBI offices around the country, agents were asking themselves a question that wouldn't go away. How did Frank Sinatra rise so far so fast, in an industry controlled by organized crime, without owing something to the men who controlled that industry? The answer, according to FBI analysis, was that he did owe them, not in any way that could be proven in court, not with contracts or paper trails, but with something more subtle and more binding: mutual benefit. Sinatra's fame was good for the mob-controlled clubs where he'd started. His recordings sold through mob-connected distribution networks. His radio play was facilitated by men who took payoffs from the same criminal organizations that the FBI was targeting. And as Sinatra's power grew, as he became someone who could make or break a nightclub just by agreeing to perform there, he became more valuable to organized crime, not as a criminal, but as what FBI analysts were starting to call an influencer, someone whose legitimate fame could be used to advance illegitimate interests. The 1938 arrest, that moment in the Hackensack police station when the flashbulb captured a furious young man, had been forgotten by the public. The charges were dropped, the scandal faded, and America moved on to embrace Frank Sinatra as a wholesome entertainer, a boy from a working-class background who'd made good through talent and determination. But the FBI never forgot. That mugshot, that arrest record, remained the first document in a file that was growing thicker every year. And what the Bureau understood, what they would spend the next 5 decades trying to prove, was that the arrest hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been a revelation, a glimpse into a pattern of behavior that would define Sinatra's relationship with law enforcement for the rest of his life. The young man in that photograph, eyes blazing with rage at being treated like a common criminal, had learned a lesson that day, but it wasn't the lesson the prosecutor intended. Sinatra hadn't learned to be more careful, more law-abiding, more respectful of society's rules. He'd learned that rules were for people without connections, that the law could be bent or broken if you knew the right people, and that power came not from following the system, but from knowing how to work around it. The years between 1943 and 1947 were golden for Frank Sinatra. He dominated the charts, sold out concert halls, and became the first modern teen idol, creating a template that would be followed by Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and every major pop star who came after. His personal life was messy, his marriage to Nancy was strained by constant affairs, and his temper was legendary in Hollywood circles. But none of that mattered to his fans, who saw only the romantic crooner with the heartbreaking voice. The FBI saw something else. They saw a man whose circle of friends increasingly included names from their organized crime files. They saw someone who traveled to cities where mob conferences were being held. They saw a pattern of behavior that suggested either the world's most incredible coincidence or a deliberate relationship between the most famous entertainer in America and the most dangerous criminals in the country. And they saw opportunity, because in 1947 Frank Sinatra would make a decision that would forever cement his place in FBI files. He would accept an invitation to travel to Havana, Cuba for what was publicly described as a vacation. But FBI agents who'd been monitoring organized crime activity knew that in February 1947, Havana was hosting something much more significant than a vacation destination. It was hosting a summit, a gathering of the most powerful mob bosses in America, including men like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and representatives from every major crime family. And when FBI agents reviewed passenger manifests from flights to Havana that month, they found a name that shouldn't have been there: Francis A. Sinatra. The singer who'd been arrested 9 years earlier for a morality charge was now flying to Cuba to meet with the most wanted criminals in America. The mugshot from 1938 had promised this moment. The angry young man in that photograph, the one who'd raged against being treated like a criminal, was about to walk into a room full of actual criminals and sit down as an equal, or perhaps something even more troubling, as a friend. Looking back at the 1938 arrest through the lens of everything that came after, the FBI's interest makes perfect sense. That wasn't just a young man making a mistake with a married woman. It was the first documented moment when Frank Sinatra's personal choices brought him into contact with the legal system, creating a record, a data point that could be referenced and expanded upon. The arrest record showed that Sinatra performed at mob-connected venues. It showed that he moved in circles where criminal associations were normalized. It showed that when faced with legal consequences, he had access to lawyers and connections that made problems disappear with suspicious speed. Most importantly, it showed the Bureau something about Sinatra's character, about who he was beneath the public persona of the romantic crooner. It showed a man with a violent temper, a sense of entitlement, a belief that normal rules didn't apply to him, and a willingness to associate with people that most Americans would cross the street to avoid. The FBI's decades-long surveillance of Frank Sinatra, which would eventually fill over 2,000 pages and span from 1938 until his death in 1998, started with that single mugshot. Every investigation after that, every wiretap, every surveillance photo, every informant report, traced its origins back to November 26, 1938, when a local prosecutor decided to make an example out of a skinny singer from Hoboken. The prosecutor probably thought he was enforcing public morality. What he actually did was create the foundation for one of the longest, most extensive FBI surveillance operations in American history, because that arrest told the Bureau everything they needed to know. Frank Sinatra was someone who needed watching. His talent was undeniable, his fame was real, but his associations were dangerous, and his potential to serve as a bridge between organized crime and legitimate society was something that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI could never ignore. For the rest of his life, Frank Sinatra would be haunted by that mugshot. Not because it was widely circulated, it wasn't. The arrest was largely forgotten by the public. But because it existed in FBI files, a permanent record that could be pulled out and examined whenever questions arose about Sinatra's associations. When he was investigated for his Havana trip in 1947, agents pulled the 1938 file. When he campaigned for John F. Kennedy in 1960, and questions arose about his mob connections, the mugshot appeared in FBI briefings. When his Nevada gaming license was threatened in the 1960s because of his friendship with Sam Giancana, investigators referenced the original arrest as evidence of a lifelong pattern. The photograph became shorthand for everything the FBI suspected but could never quite prove about Frank Sinatra. It was evidence of poor judgment, criminal associations, and a man who existed in that dangerous gray zone between legal and illegal, between entertainment and organized crime. In 1998, when Frank Sinatra died at age 82, the FBI file was finally closed, but it was never destroyed. Those 2,000 pages, including the original mugshot from 1938, remain in federal archives today, a testament to one of the most complex relationships between a celebrity and law enforcement in American history. The young man in that photograph, standing against a police station wall with fury in his eyes, could never have imagined that this moment would follow him for 6 decades. He thought he was being persecuted for a simple affair, harassed by small-minded people who couldn't accept his success. What he didn't understand was that he just opened a door that would never fully close. The FBI had seen something in that arrest, in the circumstances surrounding it, in the connections that made the charges disappear so quickly. They'd seen the beginning of a story that would intertwine with the Havana Mob Summit, with JFK's presidency, with Sam Giancana and Lucky Luciano, with Las Vegas casinos and Hollywood studios, with 5 decades of American cultural and criminal history. Today, when we listen to Frank Sinatra's music, when we watch his films or read biographies celebrating his talent and cultural impact, that 1938 mugshot is rarely mentioned. It's a footnote, an embarrassing moment in a legendary life. But to the FBI agents who spent their careers building that 2,000-page file, it was never a footnote. It was the prologue, the first chapter in a story about how organized crime and American entertainment became so deeply intertwined that they couldn't be separated. It was proof that the man America loved as Old Blue Eyes had always had a shadow following him, a darkness that existed alongside the spotlight. The arrest in 1938 didn't make Frank Sinatra a criminal, but it made him visible to people whose job was watching criminals. And once that visibility was established, once that first file was opened and that first photograph was placed in federal archives, Frank Sinatra would never be invisible again. The real question, the one that FBI agents debated for 50 years and that historians still argue about today, is whether Frank Sinatra was a victim of overzealous surveillance, a talented artist unfairly persecuted for friendships he couldn't control, or whether the FBI was right to watch him so closely. Were they documenting the truth about how organized crime used celebrity for its purposes, or were they harassing an innocent man based on guilt by association? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, in that complicated space where most truth exists. What's undeniable is that November 26, 1938 changed everything. Before that date, Frank Sinatra was just another singer trying to make it in a tough business. After that date, he was Francis Albert Sinatra, FBI subject number 100 HQ 77147, a man who would be watched, investigated, and documented for the rest of his life. And it all started with one photograph, one arrest, one moment when a flashbulb exploded in a Hackensack police station and captured an image that would echo through 6 decades of American history.